Hello, everyone. My name's Anna, and I'm very happy to be here to talk about the mission of our generation, SPARQL Generation. So this is the result of joint work between the SIB and the Riken Institute of Japan. And I propose that we first take a step back and have a look at the success story. So a brief history of bioinformatics databases, if you will. Because I do think we've made a lot of progress. So we went from a world where different groups were working on different topics, and often they would share very little in common. And it got so bad that there was this famous quote that biologists would rather share their toothbrush than their gene name. And I think we've made a lot of progress since then. So we are now in a world where we have links between data sets and we have knowledge graphs, which are very nicely interoperable and connectable. There is still a lot to be done, but we have also a principled way to go about it. So we're striving to get towards fair data, and semantic web technologies are helping in this process. But one problem still remains, and I think it has been acknowledged many times. So we don't just want to make these data sets interoperable for the purpose of it, but rather because we want to be able to answer questions, scientific questions that sometimes can also span across multiple disciplines. So for example, presuming that you have 3 different data sets for gene expression, orthology, and maybe disease, if these are knowledge graphs that are interoperable and that can be queried jointly, this should allow you to answer questions such as, what are the human genes involved in a type of cancer, for example, lung cancer, with an equivalent in some model organism like the mouse? And this has been something that we were striving towards, right? To get insights from this aggregated data. And the problem that we still have today is that actually generating the query, I'm sorry for the formatting, actually generating the query and writing the query to get this information is very challenging to do. So the equivalent technical query that would answer the question is difficult to write. So we would like to have a system that would help us get from the question to the query automatically. Now, this is not a new problem, and of course, there has been a lot of advancement in the recent year, especially, but in a prior world, before the era of LLMs, we were already kind of working on this, and we've come up with a system that was based on traditional methods, and this is a little bit of context. I had some students who were willing to help, and I presented this method early last year. And I don't know if you have this experience, but sometimes students can be very unforgiving, and after I presented this, they didn't say it explicitly, but they were like, this is the old stuff. I mean, what is the new stuff, And of course, this was quite a hit for my ego, okay, but it's predictable, it's deterministic, it kind of works. But it also challenged me. Okay, maybe there's, something new emerging. And there was indeed something new emerging at the time, the new kid on the block, right? ChatGPT. It was gaining a lot of adoption. So if we calculate 2 months from the time when it appeared, it was kind of early last year when this started to really get a lot of traction. Of course, because of this, the students were kind of very excited about this. So I said, you know what? Fine. Let's give it a try. With the skepticism that comes with, the scientific background, and maybe, yeah, I'll just try it. Actually, it turns out that it works pretty well. I have to say, I was surprised. So in the case of knowledge graphs that are fairly well represented in the public space already, you can ask questions and then get a query automatically. So here, if you write a SPARQL query to find proteins in the rat from the UniProt, it will actually probably get you a direct correct answer because, there's a lot of training data out there for this particular case. There are other fascinating examples too. So you can also ask it to explain queries, and this works rather well if you have documentation in the public space as well. So maybe that's a hint to improve on this documentation. Probably now is a good time to do it. And I was quite surprised at how, human understandable, just asking, zero shot, if you will, explain me this query, how human understandable the explanation is, and can tell you what the database that you're asking is, and so on. And this is quite helpful for people that are not familiar with SPARQL queries. But so this gave us preliminary evidence, right? This is more of anecdotal evidence that it probably works to generate queries. It probably works to explain existing queries as long as you have documentation. So now we wanted to be a little bit more systematic about it. So at the Riken Hackathon, actually, last year, and this is where things started, we wanted to come up with a sort of methodology that would allow us to be a bit more systematic and to see how well this works in practice to generate SPARQL queries. And this is the idea that we came up with. So we start from a catalog of representative example queries over a target knowledge graph. We try to augment the catalog somehow automatically. We enrich the queries with as much semantic hints as we can, so with labels, with comments that have information about the query. And I will go through all of these steps one by one, but I want to highlight the high-level idea. And then we take those queries and the questions and we try to fine-tune, in our case, an open source large language model to see how well this works in practice. And we chose to do this for Bgee, which is a gene expression database in the catalog of SIP. And it was recently recommended as an interoperability resource by Elixir, so it was quite a natural choice. It's one of the few recommended interoperability resources, knowledge graphs in Elixir. So, step by step, we want to start from a catalog of example queries. Is this practical? Yes, because most databases at least should provide such a catalog of examples, because this is what users interact with in the beginning to try to understand how to formulate queries. So Uniprot has such a catalog, and other databases do too. And we also have some sort of tutorial for Bgee. So we took the questions that existed already there, and we used this in order to generate more. How do we then generate more? Well, we have the schema information. So we take the queries that we already have. We look at how to extend with one more hop. So for example, one extra property. I will show a concrete example in next minute. And we then reconstruct the question that corresponds to this query, also automatically. So if we look at an example, let's say we take data type properties. Concretely, maybe we have a question like, what are the anatomical entities where some human gene is expressed at some developmental stage? Now, we know from the schema of the knowledge graph that the expression condition also connects to expression scores. So what we can do is to go from this question to one that is just adding one more hop. Why? Because we increase the coverage of the questions over the knowledge graph, right? So you can say, what are the anatomical entities where the human gene is expressed at the post-generalized stage, and what are the expression scores? And the corresponding query will be something like this. So if you have in the beginning, we don't need to go textually over this. If you add a new property, it will result essentially in a new triple pattern in the original query. And there's also a way to go back to the question based on the labels. So here, if you know that this property has expression level, has a label, then you can sort of put the label as part of the question text. Relatively simple, and the first step that you can do in order to get more questions than you have initially. So the next part is to add a little bit more hints semantic hints, if you will, to the queries. Why? Because it's not always obvious in the questions, in the catalog of existing questions and queries, what is the connection between the question and the query? Because these examples were not written with the idea that, okay, now we will train a system to learn from these. They were just written as examples. So here, if I say, in which taxa is the insulin protein present, the query provided by, let's say, the database maintainer may look something like this. And now, as a domain expert, or maybe as a knowledge graph expert, I would know that insulin corresponds to INS. But the link is not obvious. So a system, unless it has seen many examples of this association, will not know it. But we can take the label from the knowledge graph and inject it into the original query as a sort of hint. So wherever we have extra labels, also for properties which have identifiers, right? They don't need to look human readable. We extract these labels and we try to put them as comments in the original query so that perhaps now the system can see, okay, this triple somehow associates to this part, and this triple somehow associates to taxa. That's the premise of this. So all in all, what we did is we used an open source large language model, OpenLlama, to apply the fine-tuning methodology in order to see if we can get from the question to the query automatically. So we did a few experiments. First, we wanted to see whether the model has some prior knowledge. So if we don't show it any examples, does it know how to answer questions? And the response was no. So basically, without showing it extra examples, it didn't know anything a priori. The result was practically zero. And then we tried to compare the added value of each of the hints that we would do. So the original query, just showing the examples, we got to somewhere around 38% precision, F1 score. And by adding more semantic hints, we were able to get to somewhere around 60%, which is okay for a start. We also did a little bit of a more experimental thing where we tried to show queries over Wikidata as a fine-tuning step, and to see if there is some sort of transfer learning possible to Bgee. But this didn't really help that much because the queries over Wikidata and Bgee are quite different, I think. But perhaps there is something to tweak there and to see maybe just over some fractions of it, or I don't know. And in another experiment, what we wanted to see was, does it matter that we have more example questions? We hope that it matters. And indeed, what we see is that by training on just a fraction of the catalog, the augmented catalog that we created, the results were poorer, and there is an increase as you construct more and more example queries. This probably plateaus at some point, but because the main challenge is that we don't have enough example questions. We need to either get logs or to actually construct them somehow. So in conclusion, we came up with a method to systematically augment a catalog of questions and queries so that we would be able to try and fine-tune an open source large language model. And it did seem that systematically augmenting the initial catalog results in improvements, and that also providing these semantic hints is meaningful and is a good way to sort of make the system see the connections between the triple patterns and the original question. And as future work, there is a lot to be done. This was basically the result of a hackathon and its continuation, so there's much more to be done. But we would like to evaluate different models and to apply this methodology to different knowledge graphs. Actually, applying it to more knowledge graphs is probably relatively straightforward because we didn't do anything very data set specific. And the more long-term extension, let's say, or the more complicated one would be to add multi-hop augmentation to queries. So instead of just going to the neighbor node or to the neighbor property to go to more nodes, but then you would have to check if the queries that you generate automatically actually make sense or not. And maybe some key takeaways. Listen to your students. Maybe this doesn't get said often enough. They can bring fresh perspectives to our problems. Also, take part in hackathons. It's fun. I've learned this throughout the last year, and I'm still having fun taking part in this. And yeah, finally, we invite you to be a part of the SPARQL generation. I want to thank my colleagues, Julio, Tarcisio, and Norio Kobayashi. We have a great team, and we invite you to be part of the SPARQL generation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very nice work. So in your performance metrics, it seems that you have a better F1 score when you provide meaningful variables compared than with injecting comments. So do you have any idea? Do you think that it's more important to focus on the variable names rather than comments, or?
Yeah, it's very hard to say. I mean, the variable names, maybe it's easier because they are somehow shorter. Sometimes the comments that we added, if it's a label, it can be a lot more verbose. But I have to say that I cannot give a clear answer on this, but it would be nice to see. And there are many other things that we haven't looked at all, and that would be nice to see. But I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a lot of trial and error, I have to say. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. It's very nice and interesting. I was wondering, like, what is the cost, like the GPU consumptions and the time you take to fine tuning the models? And yeah, also, yeah, comparing to the open source models and the ChatGPT, and you just do the prompt tuning, and who performs better comparing to your fine tuning models?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we would need to actually compare to ChatGPT systematically. We haven't done this yet, but it would be probably one of the first things to try. And in the meantime, more models have appeared. And I think for using smaller size models that you can deploy locally, this will not be, for the fine-tuning part, this will be a task of maybe a few hours at most. But we also didn't have a very large catalog of questions. So we have a few hundreds that we generated. And probably for a big data set, you would have more. And of course, you need to factor this in. Yeah.
May I ask one more question? So
yeah,
like
sure.
when it comes to the very complicated SPARQL queries, how's the performance? I mean, I assume that like comparing to the simple queries, it's okay, and the accuracy is acceptable. But when we encounter that when it comes to very complex SPARQL queries that generated by open source large language model, it always the accuracy goes down very quickly comparing to the simple ones. So I was wondering, like, how's your fine tuning outcomes?
Yeah, so that's a good question, but I think there are two ways to look at this. If the questions are complex, but they fall into some sort of typical types, then it's easy to solve them. The complexity is not necessarily the main problem. The problem is the diversity of the question. So if you cannot capture in the training set questions that look like the ones that the users would ask, then probably regardless of if they are easy or complex, the performance would be rather poor. So for this, you need to kind of be able to anticipate and probably also to monitor in time what are the kinds of questions that are being asked and to reflect this in the catalog. So I would say, even if you have complex questions, if you know the type of question in advance, the system will be able to learn them. And for us, actually, the questions that we had were rather complicated. So if you would use a traditional method that is just based on minimum subgraph matching or things like this, it would be very hard to come up with it. But because it's a representative question, the model can learn. If the user asks a similar one, it can generate that.
So I would be interested in seeing how it deals with synonyms, even within non-target words within the query. So if you're asking it, okay, give me or I want, if there's a lot of difference between, if it gives a different output at all.
Yeah, that's something interesting to look at. My intuition would be that this is the perfect reason to use an LLM because it should be good at being sort of not changing when you just use a synonym, and that's the bad part about traditional methods, that they would be very sensitive to I don't know, or if you have index methods, right? If you use something out of vocabulary, it would not work. Here, the vocabulary is everything, so I presume that it will work well. But we have to test this. So maybe the next part will be for us to generate paraphrasing of the question, then to see how well it works. We actually thought about it, but we didn't do it yet.
Okay, one last question at the back.
Fascinating work. I had maybe a two-part question. The first part, just to understand, so the metrics you're using are mostly like basically you're measuring, let's say, blue BLEU. You're trying to see how correctly every word of the query is matched. Yeah, is that, or did you use other metrics? Because then my second question I want to see.
No, so we didn't yet use other metrics, but that's also, yeah.
So then the second question was like, do you think it pays off to then run actually the queries and then look at the results? Because I can't help think about the OpenAI demo where they have this task where they're supposed to get out of the walls, and after 5 minutes, one of the cartoon figures, instead of pushing the walls, just figures out to jump over the wall. So it finds a way that wasn't in the data. So maybe then it makes sense to look at run the query and see if the way the query was by the LLM written is actually better, maybe, or more accurate than the ground truth. That's kind of what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I think for data sets like Wikidata, where there is a lot of training, where there are a lot of training examples, it might make sense to go in this direction. For us, I'm not sure. We can try it, but we have few examples, so I'm not sure if it will be able to be very creative. But for Wikidata, that would be actually pretty easy to try, I would say. And there are data sets that can be used directly. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.